Today's guest on the Winning Teams podcast is Projjal Ghatak. Now, Projjal is the CEO and founder of an organization called OnLoop. And what OnLoop is doing is it really is reimagining performance management for organizations and kind of turning the tables on it so that it's becoming something that is valuable, something that is engaging, which is my experience, it never has been, and also something positive and can really impact the culture of an organization. But it's really helping managers and employees to work together in terms of their own development and not become this kind of awful experience, what I call combative experience, where it's a kind of a win-lose situation when it comes to performance reviews. So I think it's a massively important topic because organizations are globally are struggling with retaining and attracting talent. And if we look at the reason that people and talented people are leaving organization, it is as a result of not feeling that they're being developed. So what OnLoop is doing is really kind of coming into that space where I think it's massively valuable. They're doing it in a very innovative way, using the latest in technology and using mobile phones. Again, they're imitating what fitness companies have done. And I think that what they're doing is really, really clever. So I do encourage you to listen to Projjal, and I would encourage you to actually reach out and have a conversation with Projjal as well, because I think what he's doing, if you're leading a team of people, I think that this is something that you could trial, you could test, and I think you could find some really good results. So sit back and listen to the very interesting story of OnLoop with its founder, Projjal Ghatak. Projjal, thank you so much indeed for joining us here on the Winning Teams. It's a great pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, John. It's great to be here.
Well, I'm really interested in your business, but I'm also very interested on your journey to kind of setting up the business. And I think that the context is really important because, you know, the topic of performance management, which we'll dig into a little bit later, is a real hot topic for organizations. I think that's true globally from my experience. And but I really would like to understand kind of where you came from with it. What was the thought process that got you there? Because I think that is important.
No, totally. So, I think language matters. And I think the term performance management in itself is broken at some level. Because if you talk to every single knowledge worker in the world, they're going to tell you they want to be developed, not performance managed. And when you tie very important rituals like feedback and goals to something that people don't like, you end up with a bad outcome. Mm-hmm. And so, when we started building the company, I think our general insight was that performance management as an exercise, as an experience, is one of the very few universally hated practices at companies globally. I think quarterly or annual planning is probably a close second, but performance management takes the cake. And when something is as universally hated, I think it often requires a very fresh, white slate perspective on it, on how to fix it. And that's where we were really born, because we started with a problem versus a solution. And we can discuss sort of what might be broken with it. But that's one of the first things I would lead off with, that the term performance management itself gives me a lot of allergies.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting you should say that, because I do get myself into trouble with the kind of HR functions in organizations, because my overall comment is performance management systems just simply don't work, right? Right. They don't actually do what they set out to do. They right. end up being a somewhat really hated process. I agree with that. It's also kind of a combative, right? It's kind of a win-lose situation. So the whole thing about the whole concept of about improving performance somehow just gets completely lost in the whole way that it is rolled out. So when you came to developing OnLoop, what were the things that you actually looked at? What were kind of the building blocks to say, okay, if we're going to change this, what are the core things that we must change?
Yeah, and I think going back to context, I think there are a few institutions that have shaped me. And I started my career in management consulting at Accenture Strategy. And obviously, in a management consulting environment, there is a huge focus on people development and sort of giving people constant feedback and really focusing on what to make someone better. So the fact that I started my career in management consulting definitely sort of was an experience that played a role in this journey. I think the second is Stanford Business School. And Stanford Business School is really a 2-year exercise in figuring out who you are as a leader, an investigation into self-awareness. And that investigation obviously has feedback at the very center of it. And then the third was 3.5 years at a company called Uber, which is obviously controversial in how it built out culture. But my experience with tools like Reflective and Workday in managing large organizations and realizing how much of a form-filling exercise we were undertaking than actually bringing out the best in people. And so, if you think about high performance, and I think at the end of the day, every leader in the world is striving for a high performance organization. Goals and feedback are a very foundational part of high performance. But the implementation of goals and feedback in organizations has been largely through the practice of performance management. And therefore, what we said is we're building a brand new category, and we call the category Collaborative Team Development, or CTD. And that is Gen AI powered habit forming goals and feedback for high functioning teams. And I think what we've been lucky to see is a massive evolution of habit forming technology, mostly in areas like fitness, as well as obviously the recent explosion of Gen AI that truly allows us to rethink the cadences, practices, sort of flywheels around things like well-being, goals, feedback, skills development in organizations, whereby they're implemented in a way that people run towards versus run away from.
So if I am taking your tool, OnLoop, and I'm implementing it in my organization, what am I doing that is very different to what I've done before? And what does it look like from both the manager perspective and also the I suppose the person that we're managing?
Yeah. So I think the very first one, and people have talked about continuous feedback or continuous performance management for a very long time, but if we've looked at any product that's come out in the last 10 or 15 years that's been habit forming, it's been on your phone. And so we've taken a very mobile native approach to how we built OnLoop out right from the get-go, because we realize that a clunky website that takes a few minutes to load is not going to build habit. And if we have to really put feedback and goals at the sort of center of how work gets done, building that habit is key, and therefore mobile native is key. I think the second is that from a design perspective, we build the product in a way that felt less heavy, more consumer, and a lot more approachable. And so we designed it like Canva or Uber or Instagram or a product that people love, versus sort of traditional enterprise tooling that felt like it was a chore versus something people were excited to do. The third is that we started implementing generative AI in our product pretty early to take away some of the, let's call it painful perspectives of performance management, in one of them being writing performance reviews. And so we made a bet on partnering with OpenAI's technology in 2021 and had a pipe dream saying, hey, if we had regular feedback come into the system, could we actually use that data to structure a well-written performance narrative that didn't require a human being to write it, and the human being could focus on all of the observations versus the narrative creation. And then the last one is that we link feedback to skills and skills to learning. And so we infer behavioral skills based on the feedback that's being received to sort of compound and give a much fuller picture of each person. And then we sort of auto drip new content into the app to help people grow in the areas that they want to grow. And so we've taken the stack of all the things that a manager needs to do to run the team most effectively day to day, not from the task of getting work done from a project management perspective, but from the perspective of what do I need to know to understand what's happening with each team member, and then sort of intervening as needed. And so we use a metric called the clarity score in the app, similar to your sort of P2P score, and there are ways to sort of figure out how to quantify certain pieces. And then we give managers suggestions as to what action to take next based on what's happening for that team member, which has become even more pertinent in a hybrid world where managers are just not getting that much face time with their team members. And the way managers have trained themselves to manage in the past is by reading sort of the things that are unsaid and the body language cues to figure out what to do next. That now needs to be supplemented by tech, because managers just don't have that face time. And every Zoom meeting feels like a chore versus just a quick hallway catch up.
Yeah. So if I go back to, if you look back kind of at the, one different reasons why performance management systems haven't worked, very often it's not necessarily the tool, although the tool may be clunky or heavy-handed or whatever it might be, but it actually very often it fell down because of the mindset of the manager, and also the behavior of the manager, and that in turn had an effect on the mindset and the behavior of the person being reviewed. How do you then, so okay, OnLoop is the tool, how do you shift the mindset of the manager and the behavior of the manager to actually use the tool in a way that's going to be effective?
Yeah. So one of the things we believe, and might be controversial, that no manager comes to work and says, I will be a bad manager today.
No.
I think 0% of managers feel that way. And so we actually assume good intent in managers and truly believe that the reason why they have fallen short is because they get overwhelmed, and we have not supported them with the right approaches and tools to do the work the right way. So if you think about performance management, what it is a backwards system of record that is rooted in compliance and documentation. And it sort of falls prey to what's often called the peak end theory of psychology, whereby you remember what happened at its peak, and that can happen anytime. So you remember when something goes really well or goes badly, or remember what happened at the end. And as a result, the conversations that happen between manager and team member are very much influenced by those biases, by no fault of the manager. And actually, where we take the most inspiration from is the fitness industry and the evolution of fitness trackers, and first the Fitbit and the Apple Watch, and more recently the Oura Ring or the Whoop Band. And what that does is really create excitement of people in understanding what's going on and then take actions based on it. Because what a tool does is that our tool particularly is opinionated, right? So it's a tool that comes with an approach. And that approach very much is a forward-looking system of action versus a backward-looking system of record. And when you have a forward-looking system of action, that inspires action versus inspires compliance, which is what performance management is.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, I suppose the other, what's kind of going through my head as we're talking about this Projjal as well, is that how do you, because and it's kind of going back to what you were saying, because the performance management process historically has been seen as a drudgery. I mean, kind of an awful thing. So how does this make it a positive experience as opposed to a drudgery?
Totally. I think it goes back to inspiring behaviors that people already do and understand, and using that to compound data over time. So for example, people are very used to giving verbal sort of in the moment feedback, often informally, right? So now in the app, what we can do is we can record someone's stream of consciousness. So say John is thinking about the daily reflections or weekly reflections on the work done by his or her team member, Tim. And then you can then infer behaviors of feedback from that stream of consciousness. And so you take all the attention to people making the observations and then compounding the information over time versus doing this really awkward, let's sit down in 3 months and then reflect back on 3 months and think about what happened. And so we insert ourselves into behaviors or rituals that are already kind of taking place in organizations, and then use that information to then inform more sort of formal conversations or processes that are happening. Because if you read any sort of habit forming sort of playbooks or guidebooks, it will say latch on to habits that already exist. So if you have a weekly one-on-one or you have a weekly team meeting, there are conversations happening which you can then, in a psychologically safe manner, take the information and then compound it. So you give back people dividend for doing the work. And people do the work if you give back sufficient reward. So if you put one unit of work and you get 10 units of reward, people will put in the work. I think people don't put in the work when the reward you get back is less than the work. So yes, it does take some work. It's not zero work in order to observe and put the observations down. But what we're seeing with our customers is that because the reward is huge and how a manager is able to then feel empowered in supporting their team better, as well as get the right insights over time, they're much more energized to do the work and not feel like it's drudgery.
Yeah. The other area, which I think is an interesting one, and I'm just curious as your thoughts on it, is that very often you hear in performance management system, well, my manager kind of favors certain things, and so there's a bias in there, right? And of course, as we enter as we are in a period where we've got greater diversity of all sorts, right, in that, then this bias, because very often we actually might have a manager who would not be managing different generations and maybe not have the understanding. How much does bias come into play when it comes into performance management? And is there any way that this tool kind of helps to kind of level that out?
Now, this is a topic close to my heart, and I came up with a concept called eloquence bias. That is, whoever sounds better is perceived to be better. And if you think of all of the D&I issues that we see in the workplace, it goes back to people's confidence levels in expressing themselves. And be it women, be it minorities, be it introverts, there are certain groups that speak up less. As a result, they're seen less, and therefore end up with worse outcomes at work. In fact, people's names and having simple to pronounce names are often a big driver of how people perform or how they get promoted. And those biases exist because those are shortcuts for people to remember when there is a lack of good skimmable data to make decisions. And because performance management is such an arduous process, which is hugely time consuming, most managers have gone back to their heuristics on how to make decisions, on how to promote and how to move people forward. And I think every well-meaning manager wants to retain their best talent, but their best talent is who they think is the talent who's most visible, not necessarily the ones that are doing the right work. So one of our pet peeves is that OKR systems have also failed organizations in sort of looking at what activity is being done at the per person level. So goals in our product are either a target, which are easy to see and measure, or they're projects or skills. And those three holistically make up the full body of someone's work. And because we look at work in a much more holistic lens, there's much a higher degree of people being seen for the work they do versus the politics that they play. And again, I think that's a factor of the process. And I think the process has created bias by making it arduous and not being able to infer skim level data from that information. And my founding story goes back to that when Uber sent me to the Philippines to inherit a 50-person team, and I had to calibrate that team in 2 weeks. And in those 2 weeks, all people did was write performance reviews. But because they had no skimmable data, when I walked into a calibration room, I was still relying on memory to decide who got promoted. And so when a process is that time consuming and biased at the same time, it's mind blowing that it's still a thing that's done at scale, because it's sort of failing at its very task, which is to give more visibility, but actually work gets done over chunks of time. And so if you take a snapshot every 3 or 6 months, you're just not going to fully see the work that's happening.
So what I'm hearing from you here, Projal, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that the OnLoop system will give me the data that actually will highlight, so that it takes the bias or the memory or the recall or the highlights in my head, whatever it might be, or the things that matter most to me, right? It takes that kind of individual bias away, and it becomes much more a data driven, so that there's no real argument over it.
I think the term I use is skimmable data. If you think
Right.
about performance reviews, they also have a ton of data. But that data, you can't do anything with that data because it's in a format that doesn't drive skimmability. And to make decisions, you have to have data that's skimmable. And so what we do is, by making it much easier to collect bite-sized regular data and then focusing on the skimmability of it by looking at what are the targets, project skills delivered, what are each person's superpowers and each person's blind spots in the form of behavioral tags, you can then have a much more informed, nuanced conversation around performance. Now, there's always going to be a subjective conversation about performance. I don't think we can ever take the subjectivity out of it. And knowledge work by its very nature is subjective.
Yeah, and I don't think you'd want to either. I don't think you'd want to, because then it just becomes like a machine.
Correct.
This is about human interaction.
Correct. And so, but there's a lack of richness of skimmable decision influencing data in how performance management is done today. And that is fundamentally what we think we can fix and are fixing.
Yeah. In terms of kind of implementing this really kind of effective and valuable and useful performance management systems,
yeah,
what are the biggest hurdles to actually making it happen?
Yeah, the biggest hurdle is performance management systems. And just the amount of baggage we've accumulated over decades with this practice. So anytime I walk into a customer to talk about this subject, there's just so much fear and there's so much hesitation. And the best analogy I use is going to a population and asking them to go to the gym. But if the only gym that they've seen for 40 years is moldy and smelly with terrible equipment, they hear the word gym and they want to run for the hills. And so you need to sort of help people reimagine that working out's actually good for you. And there are gyms and trainers that are not terrible for you. And because there have been so many bad tools and there's so much tool fatigue in organizations, I think there's a lot of barriers and hurdles around putting in a new tool. That's point number one. I think point number two is that what we've built with OnLoop is fundamentally radically new, and is a very different approach on an old topic. And that often means that you have to find the right early adopters in an organization. And similarly to generative AI and other new technologies, there's going to grow people that will gravitate, and there are people that will not gravitate. And if you look at organizations like HR and IT, they are largely risk management and compliance functions for the organization. And as a result, rightfully so, they often don't have huge risk-taking early adopters in those organizations. And so our go-to-market is very much focused on leaders of teams. And so any switched-on leader who runs a team of 30 plus people in a dynamic org is our customer. And they can come in supply chain or ops or data and AI or sales or success. We're largely indifferent. And we see a lot of commonality between a certain type of leader, irrespective of what domain they're in. And, we've seen Slack and Zoom and Asana and Trello and all of these modern SaaS tools really sort of focus on the end user and the end user experience. And so we very maniacally focus on unlocking the potential of the manager and their team versus necessarily fulfilling the checkboxes of certain functional organizations. But typically when people have thought about goals and feedback, they've typically thought about that in the realm of HR, but they have nothing to do with the day-to-day performance of teams when it's implemented with an HR first mindset. And so we make that mindset shift. And so often people call us a paradigm shift. And when there's a paradigm shift, there's often resistance. In the same way when Uber was first born, there was resistance until people realized ride hailing or ride sharing was a better way to go from point A to point B. And so that's not surprising to us. And it's not daunting to us because we know that we're bringing something radically new. It just requires a novel approach to bring that to market.
Yeah. And, and if you look at, I mean, you mentioned OKRs there a few minutes ago. And I mean, personally, I would be a fan of OKRs. I think it's kind of whether they are properly utilized or not. I think that's it. And same thing for things like balanced scorecard and various other things and various indices that companies use to measure. But one of the criticisms of things like balanced scorecard or OKRs or any of these indices is that the process becomes more important than the outcome.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Or the process becomes so onerous. And so, I mean, the process has just become so difficult to do. We need to forget why we're doing it.
Yes.
How do we make sure that we don't allow performance management, and how do we make sure that using OnLoop doesn't actually make the process so heavy that it becomes it's another tool, and maybe more effective tool, but it's still a bloody nuisance.
Correct. So with OKRs, I think OKRs, and if you look at the history of OKRs were set up to help a company achieve its outcomes. And I think it does a fairly good job in helping a company achieve its outcomes. It does a terrible job of being able to adequately measure each individual's contribution or output. So I don't take any offense to OKRs as a company goal-setting tool. I take offense to it as a way to measure performance. I think that's point number one. I think point number two is that the reason why these processes get more onerous because we're trying to take something that's inherently continuous and trying to put that into a 6-month or annual box in a way that's highly artificial. And that's why they get complicated and has layers and debates, etc. And all we're saying is, let's make it really easy to think about things like goals and feedback in a much more dynamical manner based on certain North Stars that you set at an organization level. And when you're doing performance management or you're trying to assess anything, let's connect those dots together to see what picture comes out of it versus every 6 months trying to do the dots. And so we make it much easier to think about things in a much more dynamic manner, as easy as sending a voice note or sending a tweet or taking a picture, and then letting the AI do its work to analyze and understand what's going on over a period of time to come up with a clustered, structured narrative, because that's what humans are used to. I think when you go to a football game and as a coach coaching a team, the coach is shouting out observations as the game goes by and not sitting at the end and dissecting the game without thinking through the whole game or not helping out. And if you take sort of each of those micro actions and then analyze them later, which often happens in sports, you're able to find a much clearer view of actually what happened versus only investigating that every 3 or 6 months. And the fact that planning or performance management has been a point-in-time approach and then a desire to compress large amounts of time into a single process is where I think it gets messy and antiquated and onerous.
Yeah. One of the things that I'm just curious as to your view on this, Projjal, is, and it's come up a number of times in the work that I've been doing with different clients, is that where we now have a mix of, we've got people that are in person and we've got hybrid. So we've gone from being kind of fully hybrid to some are still fully hybrid, but some are a mix of. So for managers now kind of developing people, they've got to adjust their approach to people that are in person and to people that are hybrid. And I'm just curious, when you're developing OnLoop, have you actually factored in that you're going to have within teams, you are going to have this mix? I mean, I don't know what the split is because it's different depending on each team, but it is different. And I think it does require a slightly different approach from a manager.
Yeah, well, I think, the word hybrid is new, but hybrid is the case in every distributed org, right? So when I worked at Uber and I was on Zoom half the day anyway. And so I think there are small companies that have had one location, one office that have been fully in-person pre-pandemic that have now had to adjust for a variety of reasons. But hybrid's been around for a long time. And when it comes to developing people, I don't think there should be a difference in how people operate in person and hybrid. And that should be a common way of how it's done. Now, I think it's very hard to form deep, trusted bonds and build cohesiveness in organizations if you never spend time face-to-face. I think that's a whole different problem and a whole different set of challenges. And I think that's where I think the tools that we have today don't really create that same bond. But with regards to managing performance and development, it's really investigating 5 things. It's understanding each person's well-being to understand where the productive capacity is. 2, it's driving clarity on the targets, projects, and skills they're working on and the relative prioritization. 3 is recognizing good work so they understand their superpowers. 4 is providing regular constructive feedback so they identify their blind spots. And 5, taking that data to unlock some level of continuous growth and learning. And those are the 5 things that need to be done, right? And that can be done through a quick conversation, or it can be done over a Zoom call, or it can be done through observations on an app. Essentially, that's the rhythm you're looking to drive as a manager. And I tell leaders, listen, if you have 30 people in a single room, I don't know whether you need an app to do what we do, right? Because I think you can do that face to face. But if you have a distributed team, or you have a team greater than 30 people, you're unlikely going to be able to give people sufficient attention in a consistent manner. And that will mean that the people who are closer to you will get noticed more, will get more feedback, will get more sort of developed, versus people who are further away won't. And if you standardize the process for an app that tells you exactly what to do, depending on what happens with every team member, you just drive a consistent process around it. And actually, one of the biggest pieces of advice around hybrid is if you have a distributed org, even when you're having Zoom calls, try to have one person per window so that if someone's in a different office, they don't feel like everybody's together in one place and they're far away. So I think there are rituals you can put in place whereby you equalize the playing field, irrespective of whether people are in person or not. It happens at our company too. We have a Singapore headquarters, and then we have 50% of our team that's distributed globally. And I definitely get to spend more time with people who are in Singapore. I also try and visit all of our offices to say I get some time over the course of the year with everybody in the org. But when I come to develop the team, or we do our company all hands, we never sit in one room all together with everybody out. We always have everybody in one circle because it creates a sense of equanimity between everybody in the org, and I think that's very important.
Yeah, no, I love the work that you're doing, Projjal, which is why I really wanted to get you on the podcast and to hear what OnLoop is doing, because I think it's such a fundamental issue and challenge for organizations, because it's about the attraction, the retention of talent. And the number one reason that people are leaving organizations is because I don't feel I'm being developed and grown. And so, I mean, it's a massive challenge for organizations. So I think you're really at the heart of a very, very big topic. And I think that what you're doing is fantastic. And I love the approach that you're taking. Before I can ask you to where people can get in touch with you, 2 questions that I have for everybody that comes on the podcast. One is a book that you have read that's had an impact upon you. Curious what the book is and what was the impact?
Yeah, so it's not a business book, but the book that has had the most impact is a book called The Drama of the Gifted Child. And it just talks about sort of everybody's childhood trauma and how that impacts you as an adult. And more specifically, how it impacts you as you become a parent. And so there's a bunch of work that I think every adult needs to do before they become a parent to sort of, wear off the impact that their childhood traumas had before they inherit the next generation. And a coach of mine, Hugh Keelan at Stanford, gave me that book, and it's probably had the most impact on me.
What's it? The drama? I haven't heard of that book before. The drama of the gifted child. Or the trauma of the gifted child. The drama. Maybe it could have been called the trauma of the gifted child.
Yes.
Well. And the second is the daily rituals, if you have them, what they are and how they support your day.
Yeah, I think one of the things I've started doing very recently is when I take a shower, at least move into a complete cold shower for at least 15 to 30 seconds. I think ice baths, etc., are very fashionable at the moment, but are quite tough to implement. And B, there are cases where people have fallen sick, etc. And so there's some level of nervousness around whether that much of shock to the body is good or not. But I've found this practice of moving to a cold shower for at least 30 seconds while taking a shower in the morning really help with sort of alertness and focus. There are many other things that I am trying to do better with my therapist around my daily rituals. I won't lie as to the others. One of the other things that I try and be good at, but not very good at, is drinking about a liter of cold water in the morning. There is something about coldness of water at the beginning of your day, either drinking it or shower. And so I think there's something to that. And I think even in nights where I've got 4 or 5 hours of sleep, that tends to make me significantly more alert for the day. I am not a beacon of healthy daily habits yet. Speak to me in 5 years and see if I get better. But
Projjal, we are all work in progress. Every one of us. But that's interesting. Where can people reach you? I mean, we'll put everything in the notes, but where can people reach you and find out more about OnLoop? Because I do think you're doing some really exciting stuff.
No, thank you, John. I think OnLoop's easy to find. A Google search from anywhere in the world will bring up our website, onloop.com, and you can sort of click on start free trial or get in touch that way from a product perspective. I'm also very active on LinkedIn, and so it's Projjal Ghatak on LinkedIn. If you can't find me, it's PJ Ghatak. So if you type PJ OnLoop, that should show me up. But I read every single LinkedIn message that comes to me, and so I'd love to hear from folks.
Great. Projjal, thank you so much indeed for being a guest. It's been an honor, and it's been a joy, and it's been fascinating, and continued success with the work that you're doing.
Thank you so much, John. It's been a pleasure.